You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 28th of January 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Serbia's Prime Minister quits after weeks of protests, but will that make anybody happy? Can Ukraine fight on if the US is serious about withdrawing support? And what would your personalised licence plate say? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Aliona, Hlivco and Sir William Patey will discuss the day's big stories. We'll have the latest from Belgrade as protests continue, and we'll speak to the screenwriter Bill Broyles about his experiences of the Vietnam War ahead of the release of a major new documentary series. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Aliona, Hlivco and Sir William Patey will join us shortly. But we go first to Serbia, where President Aleksandar Vučić is seeking still to address public outrage which has been simmering since November 1st, when collapsing masonry at Novi Sad's ill-maintained railway station killed 15 people. Prime Minister and former Novi Sad Mayor Milos Vučević has resigned, and President Vučić is promising to reshuffle his cabinet with extreme prejudice. But will it be enough? I'm joined now by Monocle's Balkans correspondent, Guy de Launey. Guy, always a key question at such moments. Has the Prime Minister jumped or was he pushed?
I think he was encouraged to go. I think that would be... we can say that as the very least. I mean, Milos Vučević, we got to get this straight here. I know we've got two names which sound almost the same, Vučić and Vučević, but the shorter name is the one where all the power lies in Serbia. Aleksandar Vučić is the president. He was the co-founder of the Progressive Party, and nobody in Serbia is under any illusion that Milos Vučević, the prime minister, was anything other than Aleksandar Vučić's man in the prime ministerial seat. I mean, we can come up with less flattering terms for somebody who sits in the Prime Minister's chair but really doesn't have any power of their own. That was Mr. Vučević, and he was an ally of Mr. Vučić in the Progressive Party. He was considered to be a safe pair of hands who would do what he was told and carry out what Mr. Vučić directed him to do. And he's now been directed to do one, in essence.
What has been your sense of how these protests unfolded? Because they did start, or they at least were prompted by this dreadful accident at Novi Sad's railway station. But is this one of those situations where protests have grown from being about one thing in particular into protests about everything in general?
Not exactly, I would say, in this case. I mean, it's become a student protest, and the students have been terribly keen to say, we are not aligning ourselves with any political party. And you can't really blame them for that, not least because, of course, they wouldn't want to be associated with the Progressive Party, which is Mr. Vučic's party. But when you look at the opposition, they're fragmented. There's various sort of ego groups in there. There are people who are disorganised, single-issue parties, or extreme right-wing parties. There's no coherent opposition to the Progressive Party. So what the students have been saying is, this isn't about party politics. This is about how we live in Serbia, and it's about accountability. This canopy, which collapsed at Novi Sad railway station, which, I mean, you called it dilapidated, but had been renovated, and had been renovated over a period of several years, and it was meant to be part of the government's flagship infrastructure project, this high-speed railway line between Belgrade and Budapest. This was the Progressive Party and Mr. Vučić saying, look, that's what we do for the country. We are bringing it finally, belatedly, into the 21st century. But if this canopy at a railway station collapses and kills 15 people who just happened to be standing underneath it at the time, what does that say about all of the government's projects? And what does it say about the country itself? The slogan of many of the protesters has been, we're all under the canopy. Another one has been, you've got blood on your hands, of course. And these are the things that people have really been upset about.
As you have correctly laid out there, the power in the land is very much the President, Aleksandar Vučić. So that brings us, I guess, to the big question, which is he potentially in trouble here?
He's in office until 2027, and it would be quite difficult to remove him for numerous reasons. I mean, one of which is it's easy to forget when we're talking about Serbia and Serbian politics, just how popular Mr. Vučić actually is with Serbia's voters. Yes, there are enormous problems with how Mr. Vučić and how the Progressive Party go about their business. Independent election monitors aren't the only people who've said that there's a great deal of media capture and state capture, and that it's very difficult for opposing points of view to get across. It's very difficult for opposing points of view to have any power at all, even at the local level in Serbia. This is problematic. But when it comes to election time, even with the problematic elements that are there, an awful lot of people still choose Mr. Vučić, and they see him as the strong leader that the country needs, somebody who knows what it's all about, and he plays up to that constantly. So personally, it would take quite a lot for things to turn against Mr. Vučić himself, I think. The issue now is how he gets out of this particular situation that they're in at the moment. Now, Mr. Vučević, when he resigned, talked about calming the passions and bringing people back to dialogue. That's going to take some doing, I think. But what he may have done by falling on the sword, Mr. Vučević, is take away some of the reasons for the protests to feel like they have a legitimate point. Because from the off, the protesters wanted the Prime Minister to resign. They wanted the current mayor of Novi Sad to resign. And Mr. Vučević, the Prime Minister, was formerly the mayor of Novi Sad and was the mayor of Novi Sad when the railway project began. That's why they wanted his resignation. They've got that now. They've got the current mayor's resignation. They've got documents being published about the railway station renovation project being made public. 13 people are facing charges in connection with that. The authorities are able to say, look, we've given these people pretty much what they wanted. Why are they still on the streets?
Guy de Launey, thank you as always for joining us. And on a related note, in the current issue of Monocle magazine, there is a lengthy interview with Serbia's Foreign Minister, Marko Đurić. That should be on a newsstand near you now. You are listening to The Daily with me, Andrew Muller, and I am joined now by Aliona Hlivco, founder and CEO at St James's Foreign Policy Group, and Sir William Patey, the former British diplomat, now political consultant. Hello to you both.
Hi there.
Good evening.
Aliona, first of all, bring us up to date on how your new undertaking is going. This is the St James's Foreign Policy Group. I think last time we spoke, you said it was a laptop on a table. How is it going now?
It's still a laptop, but I also now have a screen, so I feel way more professional. But thanks for the plug, Andrew. And in all honesty, I think it's going really well. I've developed several more projects that are quite exciting. As you have heard previous time, I'm advising Lord Ashcroft on Ukraine and several initiatives he's leading there on humanitarian efforts and supporting civilians at the time of war, as well as organizing the Black Sea Security Forum in Odessa this coming May. So that's the space to watch. But I've also developed several projects dealing with the novelty of artificial intelligence. I'm helping implementing an AI platform for one of the leading UK media outlets, which is going really excitingly. And I hope I can tell you all about it one day, or you will see how AI is ruling British media going forward. As well as working on societal resilience for European nations, applying for NATO funding with Ukrainian AI defense company as well, who's learned and created this platform to identify and tackle disinformation online that results in foreign interference and effectively disrupts our societies in the West, hence waging hybrid warfare on all of us, on all European states. So I would say that it's going well. I'm fulfilled professionally, and I still feel like I'm contributing to the peace and security of the world, if that's not too grand to say.
It's tough, I think, William, for the rest of us to live up to. I mean, contributing to the peace and security of the world. We do our best. But you, as I understand it, will shortly be returning to one of the places in which you served as HMG's person.
Yes, next week I'm off to Riyadh to control risks, who do a risk map every year in which they set out the risks that companies are facing in the globe, and more particularly in the Middle East. So it's an exciting time to be back in Riyadh and looking at the Middle East. We await Donald Trump's Abraham Accords 2.0 and the whole reshaping in the Middle East. So we'll see what the Saudis are making of that when I get there.
Well, we look forward to hearing about that upon your return, but we will start tonight in Ukraine, which is perhaps beginning to understand what the restoration of US President Donald Trump means for its immediate fortunes. A general freeze on foreign aid imposed by Trump has cut funding to many Ukraine-based NGOs and/or humanitarian projects, including those supporting Ukrainian media and healthcare and helping look after injured veterans of Ukraine's 3-year struggle for its survival. This has occurred despite the transparent, if understandable, attempts of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to flatter Trump into seeing this from Ukraine's point of view. Aliona, before we get into the specifics of this, a general question. We are now nearly 3 years since Russia launched its full-scale attack on Ukraine, an operation which I think Russia anticipated would take 3 days. So Ukraine has clearly held up a lot better than Russia thought it might. But what's your general sense of how it is holding up, though? Because this has been 3 years of a struggle which must just have been exhausting to your country at every imaginable level.
Well, this fight has been exhausting, even to me, being based in London, but still having family back home and friends who experience missiles and drones still every single night, every single day flying towards them. People have now adjusted to celebrate their birthdays next to bomb shelters, getting ready to face blackouts with candles and heaters and batteries and all the rest. So, yes, Ukrainians are exhausted, but they're, I would say, much more resilient than they were at the beginning of the war. I think people are bracing themselves for a tough year. There is hope, of course, that the status quo will change with the Trump's presidency. And it's not simply going to be the war of attrition of expecting Biden to give more and yet never really delivering as much as needed. But at the same time, there are no illusions about very quick resolutions because Ukrainians have been there before with the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 15. And we've seen that the ceasefire doesn't go far with Russia just because they don't abide by any agreements. So unless you hit them where it hurts and they understand that power rather than goodwill, then it might work. And that's the only hope that we have with President Trump.
I mean, William, should Ukraine perhaps anticipate this move of Trump's of suspending foreign aid, not just to Ukraine, but generally, as sort of a prelude to the idea that the US might pull the plugs on this completely?
I think this decision is unrelated to Ukraine. I think Ukraine's suffering from collateral damage here. This is a much broader thing for the whole world, and we're seeing it all over the world. He has, for 90 days, has suspended all American aid, and America is by far the largest donor of aid, over $72 billion. So this is going to affect Africa. I chair a charity that's operating in Afghanistan. We get USAID money. That will be stopped. So there'll be consequences all over the place. I mean, 40% of all the UN's humanitarian assistance comes from the United States. So this is much broader. I think I think there was some lack of clarity on whether our military equipment would go to Ukraine. I think that's been clarified. I think along with Egypt and Israel, Ukraine will also continue to receive military aid. It's all the other aid that they won't get. So they're part of a wider package. And I was looking at the State Department announcement of this that said all aid to be resumed will have to meet I presume it's one of the criteria, not all of them. Does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? And does it make America more prosperous? Well, that's never really been the criteria for giving aid in any country, but you could argue in Ukraine, helping the Ukrainians does make America safer and stronger. It doesn't make it more prosperous, but it makes it safe. So you're going to have to argue the toss for every resumption of every piece of aid over the next 3 months, and there's going to be a lot of casualties. So it's quite a significant moment for the world, the world's largest donor, to just stop giving stop donating overnight.
I mean, Aliona, obviously on those criteria, Ukraine does have a case it can make to the United States, as William was just saying. And indeed, it is the case Ukraine has been making now for 10 years and change. But On this specific front, the other case that Ukraine has been making for 3 years is that we have all this time to get used to the prospect that Donald Trump may be re-elected president of the United States, and Europe needs to start thinking seriously about that. Is it your sense that Europe has thought seriously enough about what to do if the US decides it's not interested in this anymore?
I think we could summarize all of those three criteria into one: make America great again. And to paraphrase another American president, yes, we can, meaning Ukraine can definitely contribute to that American greatness and for the liberal world order to prevail at the end of the day. But when it comes to your question on Europe, it's a tricky one because, yes, they have thought for a long time, but they keep thinking and they keep talking about it and they keep proposing various options for increasing funding for Ukraine. But the next budget for the next 7 years in Europe will only get through in 2027. And I believe they simply don't have the capacity to make a very rapid change, given the well-known European bureaucracy, to their budgets to support Ukrainian NGOs in a much broader capacity. And sadly, the same goes even for the UK. When we talk about Westminster, international aid budget has only been going down in the last few years. So the UK, even given the latest UK-Ukraine 100-year partnership agreement, which was another exciting project that I've contributed to actually working with FCDO on that deal, they did insert quite a lot of proposals from us, Ukrainian experts, including myself, on supporting civil sector in Ukraine, on arranging cultural exchanges, student exchanges, programs for youth, for societal resilience, etc. But it has only been signed, so it will take such a long time to create a framework and implement it, let alone to find the budget.
Well, let's move along now to Brexit, the manifold bounties of which will surely rain down upon us any day now. In the meantime, the UK and the EU will this week glare at each other across a courtroom in a row over sand eels, which, for listeners unfamiliar with the species, is an elongated silvery fish, bushels of which you may have seen clutched in stripy beaks in pictures of puffins. It turns out that if for nobody and nothing else, Brexit has been good for sand eels, after the UK banned fishing for them in the North Sea, but the EU has sought to differ, as one member thereof, Denmark, has the world's biggest sand eel fishing fleet, though this, of course, may shortly need to be fitted with cannons and dispatched north to defend Greenland from the Americans. William, should we strike now while Denmark is weak?
Well, Denmark needs to be careful that they don't have the United States and the United Kingdom as an enemy at the same time. I mean, I think they need to they take a step back here. This is a conservation measure, and it's part of the whole food chain, preserving the sand eels who get eaten by by other fish, who get eaten by other fish, who get fish. So it's rather short-sighted, but when was logic ever applied to fishing? Over Brexit, I think fishing contributes something like 0.3% of the GDP of the UK.
It is not a great deal.
And it's probably even less of the European Union. And yet we get hung up over fishing. I think it's because we're nostalgic about romantic fishing villages, which still have a way of life that's been going on for centuries, in a way that we never got nostalgic about coal mines that we happily shut down and ruined whole communities. So I think there's a nostalgia about fishing. I imagine there's some lovely little picturesque Danish fishing port from which the sand eel fishermen come and probably got a very active MP. But there's no logic to why this should be quite so important or even be discussed about in a wider context of whether Britain should get closer to the European Union or join the single market or even the pro-Mediterranean, the Mediterranean Plus deal. I mean, these are much bigger issues.
Well, indeed so. But leaving aside this, and it does strike me, Aliona, as quite surprising that this is actually the first UK-EU post-Brexit trade thing to have ended up in court. Are relations, do you think, possibly improving somewhat in recent months due to the change of government here in the United Kingdom, the fact that the UK and the EU did discover a common purpose a little over 3 years ago when Russia attacked your country?
Well, I think the EU authorities were definitely probably breathing with relief when they saw Labour government in charge, not necessarily hoping for Brexit Brexit turnaround, because they also want to play hard to get and to emphasize to the UK that, they can't just come back anytime they want to. So there's still politics at play, punishing Britain enough so that other members don't think about leaving the European Union, that the whole idea of EU doesn't get undermined, even though with the war on the European continent, that, of course, has fallen off the agenda, I think, for many member states. Labour does need to activate their EU agenda. I think they're also very cautious of being too proactive on the EU front because they're not sure about, well, frankly, their support with all of their internal policies that they were doing. I did hear from some Labour politicians before they got into government that they will certainly not touch the issue of rejoining the EU even with a stick for the first 5 years of their governing, maybe only during the second term, but we now don't really see if the second term is coming. Whether Labour could be a bit more pragmatic and better placed to deal with European Union, its bureaucracy and its culture, I think there's a strong chance to rebuild that relationship.
I don't think Britain's ever going to rejoin the European Union. Even a third-term Labour government, we're not going to rejoin the European Union. What we might do, and Labour should be a lot bolder. We should be ending up where Norway is now. We should be in the single market. We shouldn't be in the European Union. We were half in, half out anyway. We weren't part of Schengen. We weren't part of the Euro. So let's accept that we're never going to be fully integrated into a European Union. But we can have a much better and a much bolder relationship. And I think this reluctance is we don't want to fight the next election on the European Union because we're probably going to fight it against the Reform Party. We know we're going to be fighting the next election on immigration. That's going to be the issue. But we'll win that fight if there's economic growth. And where's the quickest path to economic growth? It's a much closer economic relationship with the European Union, and Labour need to be a lot bolder than they are.
But just to follow it up, William, because a recent and fairly thoroughgoing poll has found that UK voters grasp this. They are keener on closer trade ties with the EU than with the United States. Even in Clacton-on-Sea, there was a majority for closer trade relations with the EU. So is it a bit weird that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, just runs a mile whenever any sort of obviously closer relationship with the EU is suggested?
Yeah, I think they were traumatised by the EU debate and traumatised by the rise of the Reform Party. But we're not going to out-Europe reform. We've got to present a better vision, and I think you're quite right. And eventually, Labour will wise up to the fact that there's quite a strong support in the country for greater freedom of movement in the EU. You see the Tories talking about. People who are culturally different. And what they really mean by that's code for a lot of people from outside Europe are now coming to the country, when before it used to be a lot of Europeans who are culturally the same. So, you could see the debate. And I think Labour are very stupid to reject the approach on the 2-year visa for citizens. And we need to, once they've got immigration under control, I think there might be a more sensible debate over the price we pay for going into the single market, greater freedom of movement for workers backwards and forwards. But we're a long way from that. I'd certainly be advocating more bravery on their part.
Well, finally to Zürich, the motorists of which will be permitted from 2027 onwards to adorn their vehicles with personalised licence plates, though you can, of course, save yourself the trouble and the money by simply applying to your car a sticker declaring, "I am fundamentally unbearable." The canton of Zürich does already auction some super fancy licence numbers, having recently fetched 226,000 francs for ZH100 and 202,000 francs for ZH50. But this new regime will permit anybody to have more or less anything, doubtless with tedious spoil sport prohibitions attached to profanity or puerile innuendo. I'm going to solicit confessions first of all. Aliona, have you ever had a personalised licence plate?
I must confess that I have.
Oh
yes.
dear! What did it?
In Ukraine, it's a completely normal practice, and there are various stages.
There are places where burning witches is a completely normal practice. It doesn't
make
it right. Well, you know what I'm saying. It doesn't make it right.
What was your personalised number plate?
In my defence, I never went for anything ridiculous, and I'm happily give you examples of other female drivers, not to be sexist, but I'm calling out my own kind, putting something like, baby Earl on their license plate or something extremely ridiculous and tacky, frankly. I just had my lucky numbers. I was lucky to get my first car with my lucky numbers just randomly. And then when I got my second car, I decided to keep the numbers, so I had to pay for it.
Okay. Are you willing to disclose what your lucky numbers were?
It was 0078.
Okay. See, I think that's okay because
that's reasonable.
That is
right?
reasonable because it is not some zany, self-glorifying slogan. William, did you ever swan about in a big limousine with flags on the front and a license plate reading HMG1 or something?
I was entitled to a personalised number plate. You see them all. You see all the ambassadors in London with NIG1, and I don't know whether that's Nigeria or Niger. But ZAM1, and I would have been entitled to a flashy number plate with a flag, but I was always in places where it was a lot wiser to conceal your identity. So I never had even a diplomatic number plate. I used to have standardised number plates that were part of the general population, and I never flew a flag. So I've always served people where
you did rather serve in places where putting a Union Jack on the front of your car would be asking for
was
it.
Inviting for it. And in many places I used to travel in a convoy of 3 identical cars in which they didn't know which one I was in. So I'm the antithesis of a personalised number plate.
I mean, I think it's probably, on balance, a fairly harmless way of raising revenue. So you can't really get too angry with Zürich for that. And having recently broadcast from Zürich for a week, I can attest that their roads are very well kept. But would anybody like to essay a wild guess at what the largest amount of money paid in the United Kingdom for a personalised licence plate is?
£750,000?
You have actually somewhat overshot it. It is 518,000 quid, which was paid in 2014 for 25.0. The idea being that if you own a Ferrari 250 Testarossa or a 250 GTO, that's the license plate you can put on the front of your fancy Ferrari. There are rumours that whoever, I believe they are based in Abu Dhabi, owns the license plate F1, is asking for a quite considerable sum for that.
Yes, well, if you've got money to spend and burn, then maybe it's a nice indulgence. But I could think of other things to spend £500,000 on.
I mean, how much did it cost in Ukraine to register a personalised licence plate? So I'm assuming less than 500 grand.
Honestly, because I didn't go for any letters or words or statements, it was much, much cheaper. It was the lowest grade of the paid license. So it was, in UK money, probably something like 10p.
I don't work for 10p.
So possibly a less efficient means of raising revenue in that respect. The paperwork would have cost more than that. Aliona Hlivco and Sir William Patey, thank you both as always for joining us. Finally on today's show, the Vietnam War, which ended 50 years ago this April with the fall of Saigon, has been analysed, memorialised and mythologised to a degree that may lead one to believe that there is nothing more to be said or learned about it. A new series from Apple TV Plus, Vietnam, the War That Changed America, demonstrates abundantly that this is not the case. The series is an extraordinary construction of archival footage and the recollections of those who were there. One of the contributors is someone who understands better than most the difficulties of conveying the reality of conflict as seen from up close. Bill Broyles, who after serving in Vietnam as a young Marine Corps officer, went on to a stellar career as a screenwriter. His credits including Apollo 13, Castaway, Jarhead and Flags of Our Fathers. I spoke to Bill earlier and I began by asking how attitudes to the Vietnam War and the people who served in it have changed over the last half century.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And I think the series itself is really beautiful about this because even within the war experience itself, the experience at the beginning of the war and then the experience toward the end where I was there was very different. But now if you look back on the war, I think it's really more a cautionary tale now about, and I'm hoping it is anyway, is to if you're going to send people off to war in a distant place, there better be a very good reason, and there better be a strategic goal, and there better be an end game, because what we did in Afghanistan, for example, was go off with similar missions that we had in Vietnam, and it lasted 20 years. It's the longest war in American history for some of the very same reasons that the Vietnam War was not a success, which was we had no overall mission. The people who served there, their main mission was to do their duty for the time they were allotted and then to go home. And then someone else came. Whereas the Afghans, they were home to go to. So their motive about the war personally, which was the same as the basic goal of the war, whereas our motive personally was just to finish our duty and get home. And then someone else would have a problem. So really, and by the way, I have a personal thing about this, which is I had hoped after Vietnam that none of my sons would have to serve in a war with no purpose like this and have their sacrifice, because the people who serve they have to be part of a community. They have to be willing to give their lives for each other, and they do. And it better be for good reasons. And when my son, after 9/11, went off to Afghanistan and Iraq, I was both proud of him for his sacrifice, but I was so angry that he was being sent into a very similar war for very uncertain purposes. And I would dread a car coming up the driveway because I thought it was someone saying my son had been killed. And then I realized my parents must have been through the same thing with me. And I think the best lesson we can get from Vietnam and now Afghanistan is we better have leaders who are worthy of the people who serve.
But did your realization when you deployed to Vietnam of the gulf between the theory and the practice, did it come at all before you arrived, or did that only happen once you got there? Because you do speak, and this isn't really a spoiler, but you do speak in the series of, arriving at your unit as the fresh young lieutenant, that the place looked like a hobo camp, the troops were in a state of near mutiny, and the way you talk in that episode, you sound like you were more frightened of your own men than you were of the Viet Cong.
Well, that's a really good point. I wouldn't say frightened. I mean, because we were in it together, but all they cared about was they didn't care about whether I would help them win the war. By 1969, they were already withdrawing troops. They knew the war was over. They only cared, is this guy going to get us killed or not? And if the answer is yes, that's very bad for me. So what I did was just pay attention to these kids who were mainly 18, 19 years old. I was a graduate of Oxford. They were high school dropouts. They didn't care I had fancy degrees. They just wanted to know what I was going to do. And I paid attention to their experience. They'd been there for months more than I had. They knew the terrain. They knew the enemy. And when we got an order that was suicidal, basically, with no particular purpose that would save no one was at risk except us, we did a virtual mission. And that was their idea. And I just got there, and I had the good sense to listen to them. And I realized from that moment on that our mission wasn't to win the war. Everybody knew the war was over. Nothing we did was going to change anything. My mission was to keep these kids alive. And I did. That's where I won their trust.
I mean, that's a terrifying sentence, though, because you were yourself, all of 25 years old?
Yeah, I was 24, and I was the only officer. Bear in mind, there was not like it's not like World War II. It was me and these 50 kids out there in the middle of the jungle in Truong Son Mountains by the end of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And, our fates were inextricably wrapped together. And these kids, if it had been World War II, they were brave. There was nothing, they were ready to give their lives for each other. They were as brave as any soldiers that ever served. But they weren't going to give their lives for nothing. And if I was going to come out there and try to make my stripes and advance my career and tell them what to do, then the consequences for me personally or any officer like that could be difficult. So it was really quite interesting. It became a very specific war. And at the beginning of the war, it was very different. It was much more like World War II. By the time I got there, when they were withdrawing troops and everybody knew that the war was over, it became a very different personal mission. And the series, by the way, I have to really emphasize, this series captures that beautifully. It captures the change in the war. It captures the personal experience. I mean, I think this series is such a good lived experience of a war like this that should really resonate today, because we're seeing wars like this going on all over the world right now.
I mean, the series does make the point that the access that journalists, that television cameras had to this war was unprecedented, and possibly because they got so much access, I don't think anyone's ever had quite the same access since. So we have an enormous reservoir of verite footage of the Vietnam War being fought. But as somebody who then went on to make a living in cinema, I wondered what you've made of Vietnam War films down the decades. Have you ever sat through one of them and thought, actually, they've pretty much got it right?
Yeah, there have been some really good ones. And an interesting thing is I wrote a film called Jarhead about Gulf War I. And in it, I put the troops watching Francis Coppola's Apocalypse Now when the helicopters go into Wagner and you're dun 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 dun. Anyway, and it's an anti-war film, but for these kids in Gulf War, it was their recruiting poster. They wanted to do that. The paradox is, if you make this film that is really so true to the purposelessness of lots of war, the kids watching it are going to see this. I want some of that. I want to test myself. I want to see how I would do in those situations. It's an eternal. That's been true for millennia about war as a rite of passage. And my solution for this is that if you're drafting people, no one can be drafted under the age of 40. That you have to draft the people that are making the decisions to send young people to war, because there's always going to be people who want to see how they would respond. And if we can find ways in society to give people a sense of community and common purpose and a sense of testing themselves without having to do this war thing, we would really have unlocked a real key to making the world a better place.
I started out by asking how attitudes to the veterans and the war had changed over 50 years. I want to close by asking how the attitudes of those veterans themselves to the war have changed, whether you talk about it and think about it and process it differently as an older man than you might have as a middle-aged man or a younger man just back. Because in 1984, I guess the 10th anniversary or thereabouts, you wrote this essay for Esquire, Why Men Love War, and I quote, you refer to Vietnam as a war I didn't believe in and never wanted to fight. Why do I miss it? Is that still the case? Is there part of you that does still miss some aspects of it?
Well, it's so embarrassing when someone does their research and uses their own words. Well, I know it's still true. I mean, I don't miss the war. I miss the people I was with. You know, I miss those guys, and I miss the experience of waking up and having whatever I did that day count and matter, and not just being on my own and for myself and out for whatever, me. I miss being a part of something, and I think that's a human thing. I think we want to have connection. We want to be part of a group of people who are with common purpose and goals, and war gave us that. That's the paradox. Is I hated the war, but I love the people I serve with, and I miss them, and I miss that experience of when you really count at something. And we can find a way to reproduce that in peaceful life. I think we'll have a much better society and a much better experience as human beings.
That was Bill Broyles speaking to me earlier. Vietnam, the war that changed America, is on Apple TV Plus from January 31st. It's very much recommended, and we will have much more from Bill Broyles in an upcoming episode of The Big Interview. Do look out for that. That's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to our panellists today, Aliona, Hlivco and Sir William Patey, and to Guy Launey at the top of the show. The show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.